Studies show that up to 1 in 9 people with colorectal cancer will develop depression or anxiety. But what the numbers never tell you is that the hardest part for many people doesn't start during treatment. It starts after, when the world thinks you should be celebrating. Welcome to the Colorectal Cancer Outcomes Research Channel. I'm Dr. Vera. I was diagnosed with colorectal cancer at 36, and today I'm also a PhD cancer researcher. May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and I wanted to use this time to focus on the part of colorectal cancer that often goes unspoken. Mental health is hard to talk about. Colorectal cancer is hard to talk about, and when you bring the two together, that silence can be even stronger. In this video, I'm going to talk about my experiences with mental health and colorectal cancer as I share findings from my research study where I explored how people with colorectal cancer experience mental health, from diagnosis to treatment to surveillance and beyond. This study centers patient voices. I hope it helps put language to experiences that many people feel but rarely talk about. During treatment for colorectal cancer, I put my head down and focused on getting through it. Appointment to appointment, scan to scan, day to day. Emotionally, I didn't react the way people often expect. I can still remember that I only cried twice. I don't even think I cried on the day I heard the words, "You have cancer." At the time, I thought that meant I was coping well, being strong. But later, after treatment ended, that began to change. When things slowed down, the fear, anxiety, and uncertainty started to surface in ways I hadn't anticipated. As a cancer researcher, I already knew from my own work that people with colorectal cancer face a higher risk of depression and anxiety, up to about 11%, and that risk is even greater for those diagnosed at a younger age like me. What those numbers didn't tell me was how people actually experience their mental health over time. Most studies focus on a single moment. But cancer isn't a single moment, it's a journey. That's what led my team to do this study. We wanted to understand how mental health is experienced by patients with colorectal cancer, but not just whether symptoms exist, but how they showed up, evolved, and affected patients' lives. When you hear the words mental health, what comes to mind? For a long time, I didn't think much about mental health at all. It wasn't until one day after finishing colorectal cancer treatment when I felt unexpectedly low. It was hard to get out of bed. I knew I had the physical energy, but I didn't have the motivation to do much. And that was confusing. That experience made me realize something important. Mental health isn't just about having or not having a diagnosed mental illness. Mental health is about our emotional and psychological state, how we're feeling inside, how we're coping, and how our thoughts and our emotions are doing. Now, when I talk about well-being, I mean how someone is functioning overall in their daily life, not just emotionally. A mental illness refers to a diagnosed condition like depression or anxiety that causes significant changes in how someone feels, thinks, or behaves and interferes with day-to-day functioning. Here's a key point. A person doesn't need a diagnosis to be struggling. Mental health exists on a continuum. It's not all or nothing, and it can change over time. I always like to pause and define terms like these because when we're clear about what we're talking about, it becomes easier and safer to talk about them. And with that shared understanding, I want to take us back to the research study and show you what emerged when we listened to patients describe their mental health across the colorectal cancer journey. To understand mental health in colorectal cancer, we knew we couldn't rely on numbers alone. We needed to listen to people's lived experiences. So we conducted a qualitative study, which means we had in-depth one-on-one conversations with people who have been diagnosed with colorectal cancer. We spoke with individuals from across Canada. Some were in the middle of treatment, some were in follow-up, coming in for regular scans, and some were years past treatment, navigating life beyond the cancer care system. These conversations lasted about an hour, and people shared very openly. They talked about more than symptoms or treatments. They shared how cancer affected their thoughts, their emotions, and their day-to-day lives over time. As we listened, I found myself checking in with myself. Some stories felt very familiar. Others were completely different from my own experience. When we looked for patterns, something important emerged. Mental health wasn't a single experience. It changed depending on where someone was in their colorectal cancer journey, and that difference really matters. What we heard again and again was that mental health looked different depending on where people were in their colorectal cancer journey, whether during treatment, during follow-up surveillance, or beyond that. And at each of these phases, people described two things: their experience, so what they were feeling emotionally, and their response, how they coped, thought, or acted in response to those feelings. No one is ever prepared to hear the words, "you have cancer." That's why for many people, the emotional experience at diagnosis and into the treatment phase was shock. People talked about feeling stunned, devastated, or unable to fully grasp what was happening, and at the same time, there was barely any time to sit with that moment. Before the diagnosis could really sink in, treatment began. With colorectal cancer, treatment is often intense and involves multiple approaches: surgery, radiation, chemotherapy, sometimes immunotherapy, often close together. Very quickly, life becomes structured around appointments, procedures, and the next step in care. For me, that meant 5 weeks of radiation, 2 surgeries, an ileostomy, and 8 cycles of FOLFOX chemotherapy. So while this phase was emotionally heavy, many people described not having the time or the capacity to really notice or tend to their mental health. Everything was focused on the physical demands of treatment. In response to that shock, people described a clear response: coping. Coping in this phase often meant narrowing focus, putting emotions aside, becoming task-oriented, showing up to appointments, taking medications, following routines that helped them get through each day. It wasn't that there weren't any emotions there, it was that there wasn't space to deal with them yet. As I listened to these stories, this phase felt very familiar. During my own treatment, I was focused on getting through the physical process. Looking back, I can see how my emotional experience was largely put on hold while I coped with the demands of treatment. So I'll pause here and ask, what was this like for you? One mental health experience came up again and again in this study. It's something patients name all the time, but when I step into research or clinical spaces, it's often not a familiar word. Patients call it Scanxiety. If you spent time in patient communities on social media, you've probably seen it. I know I have. It's the word people use for the worry before scans, the tension at appointments, and the fear while waiting for results, sometimes for days or weeks. Scanxiety showed up whenever scans were part of care, during active treatment, between treatments, or during follow-up. What stood out was how intense this fear could be, even when things were described as stable or good. Nothing had gone wrong, but the uncertainty alone was enough to weigh heavily. One moment that stayed with me was sharing this work with other researchers and clinicians. When I used the word Scanxiety, they were often surprised. They asked me about it, and I remember being taken aback because as a patient, it felt like such a familiar term, something I hear all the time in patient spaces, but definitely much less in clinical or research ones. If Scanxiety has been part of your experience, you're not alone. What has Scanxiety been like for you? There's another mental health experience that came through clearly in this study: uncertainty. People describe in different ways that even when treatment ends, cancer doesn't simply disappear from their lives. Medical appointments may slow down, surveillance might finish, but the impact of cancer continues. This uncertainty wasn't always about cancer coming back, though that fear was certainly there. It was also about living with permanent changes to the body, changes to energy, changes to relationships, changes to how people understood their own health. For many, this uncertainty shaped daily life long after cancer care ended. This is something that resonates deeply with me. Even though I'm 10 years out from my colorectal cancer diagnosis and finished surveillance, cancer is not something I've simply moved past. I continue to live with the long-term effects of treatment. They have impacted my mental health, how I see myself, and my personal life. As I was working on this video, I was reminded of something important: how powerful language can be. Many of the mental health experiences people describe in my study, shock, Scanxiety, uncertainty, they aren't new feelings. What's new was having words for them. And when you can name what you're feeling, it often becomes a little easier to carry. For me, having space to talk about mental health has mattered a lot. I've been working with a counselor, and this has helped me make sense of emotions I didn't always have space for during or after cancer treatment. In many ways, this research study has also been a form of therapy for me. Listening to others, seeing patterns, putting words to experiences that once felt vague or unsettling, it's been deeply validating. Not because it fixed anything, but because it helped me make sense of it. And I think that's how we begin to dismantle the stigma around mental health, not by forcing positivity, not by minimizing what people are going through, but by giving ourselves and each other permission to name what we're feeling. Mental health doesn't have to be dramatic or extreme to matter. It can be quiet, ongoing, hard to explain, and still deserving of attention and care. If this video was helpful for you, please like, subscribe, and share so this information can reach others who might need it.